let's talk more in depth about this analogy that apps are people and understand what that means from a security perspective. The first thing we can think about is, what are the attacks? If we assume that apps are people, and that's the analogy we're going to use for security, what are the attacks or things that people do maliciously against each other that we want to protect against? Well, the first thing that an app can do, and maybe is common that people do, unfortunately, is they can lie to each other. So they can provide false information to each other. So one app that's interacting with another app or talking to it through IPC or intents can lie and tell it something that's not true. So as an app developer, we have to be very concerned about checking data or input validation of the things that other apps are telling us. Another thing that malware can do, since it's a person interacting with our app, is it can steal from our app. So it can try to access information, which is really the currency of apps. It can try to access that information that this app doesn't want exposed to the other app. And that information could help it to do something malicious directly to this app, or it might be the information that that app needs in order to attack somebody else. For example, to steal contacts from your app so that it can spam them and try to convince them to install the app and also be infected. So they can try to steal from each other. Another thing that apps can do, which is also sort of a form of lying, but they can try to manipulate each other by either lying or, more interestingly, going and telling one of that app's friends something that it would like that app to know in order to manipulate it, because this app may trust another app more than it trusts the malware. So this malware doesn't necessarily have to directly manipulate your app. It may use another intermediary to manipulate your app, another app that yours trusts. So you have to be concerned not only about your own security, but the security of the other apps that you talk to and trust. And it can also go and manipulate the user that's using your app by showing them a false GUI or false information and trying to convince them to do something to your app that if the user does it, you'll accept it, but another app couldn't necessarily do it. So these are some interesting things if we use this analogy of apps or people that we want to protect against. We don't want other apps to lie to us or steal from us or manipulate from us. Another thing we don't want to do is we don't want to have our app inadvertently manipulated by another app into doing something on that other app's behalf that isn't a good thing. So for example, if you told me to rob a bank, hopefully I won't do it. But if another app tells your app to go and access the internet, it's a similar type of situation. Maybe that original app doesn't have access to the internet. It really wants access to the internet, and it knows that your app does. So maybe your app is the equivalent of the bank manager that has access to the vault. So if that malware, rather than directly accessing the vault, which it doesn't have access to, can get your app, which is the bank manager, to access that vault and give that information back to the malware, that's also just as good as getting access to it itself. So we have to protect our apps from being manipulated by other apps through lying or stealing or other means in order to do things bad on behalf of another app. And we'll talk about specific types of attacks that fall into this model of lying and stealing and manipulation that malware uses to attack good apps. So how does malware potentially attack your app? Well, let's talk about how your app actually operates in practice, and then we can look at the potential opportunities for malware to change how your app operates in order to cause it to do something that it wouldn't normally do, to put it into a bad state. So the goal of malware is to take your app and to try to manipulate it in some way so that it reaches some state that you normally wouldn't have your app reach. So for example, maybe the goal is to have your app access a pay service, and so that the writer of that malware can call you to cause your app to go and access some pay telephone number that then the malware developer makes money off of. Or maybe the goal is to get your app to read some data that the malware doesn't have access to, and then to send that data back to the malware. For example, this might be your username and password for some website. So the goal of the malware is to take your app and manipulate it so that it reaches some state that the malware wants it to reach that helps the attacker in some way. So how can that malware go about manipulating your app to reach one of these states? Well, one thing that the malware could do is it could attempt to go and change the memory or the state that your application is currently running on top of. So these are things like the variable values in your objects that are currently loaded into memory. If you could go and directly manipulate those member variables, for example, in your classes, you could go and cause an app to do arbitrary things. The other thing that it can do is it can try to manipulate your stored state. So this is stuff like the configuration files that your app may rely on, or the underlying code that you've created that's packaged into an APK and actually stored on the file system itself. So malware is trying to manipulate the state of your application, either by manipulating what you store or have previously stored on disk, either getting access to it and reading it to understand your state, or possibly modifying what you've stored in order to manipulate what you're going to do the next time you execute your app. Or it can be trying to manipulate the memory, that is all of the stored variable values, the objects, the other things that your app has instantiated and loaded into memory. So it wants to either attack the memory up here, or it wants to attack the state that you've stored on the file system or the persistent storage of some type. And this is the core thing that a malware is trying to do, is manipulate your app through state changes either at the storage level typically or the memory level.